Hello, everyone. This is Mr. Cunningham, and today we're going to be entering into a new chapter, which is Chapter 8, and that talks about molecular compounds and also covalent bonding. So, in last chapter, we talked about ionic bonds and ionic compounds and how those are generally solids with high melting points. Well, I'm sure you've thought of other compounds since then that actually don't have those properties and have very different properties. For instance, water is actually a liquid and acts much differently than ionic compounds, and also gases like oxygen and carbon dioxide, which are gases at room temperature. And the attractions that hold these molecules together can't be explained by ionic bonding. Remember, ionic bonds, they are very different, and they can be explained because there's a transfer of electrons. So these, for instance, we talked about sodium chloride, and in sodium chloride, chlorine will actually take an electron from sodium to make an anion and a cation. And so today I brought a helper with me to help us remember that cations are positive. Okay, remember, cations are positive. Okay, so today we're going to be talking about uh, things that are called covalent bonds. And remember, in ionic bonding, we have that transfer of electrons. Well, in covalent bonds, electrons are actually shared, and we can represent these molecules using many different models and many different formulas. But today we're going to be talking about something called molecular formulas.
So let's talk about some molecular formulas. Now, when you hear the word molecular, I want you to think of atoms that are covalently bonded together. So these are different than ionic compounds. So when you think of molecular, think covalent, and covalent compounds are sharing of electrons. So let's look at a few of these molecular formulas. What molecular formulas tell us is actually the number of atoms that are in a compound. So for instance, CO2 is a molecular formula. And what CO2 tells us is that there is one molecule of CO2 contains 2 oxygen atoms and 1 carbon atom. Now, as you can see in CO2, there is a 2 right after the O, and that means there's 2 oxygen atoms. Now, there's no number after the C because when there is no number, we just assume and we just infer that there is a 1 there. Okay, so let's look at another one. Here is H2O, or also known as water. And now in one molecule of H2O, we have 2 hydrogen atoms and 1 oxygen atom. So molecular formulas are nice because they're easy to write and they tell us a little bit about that compound. They tell us what is in it. But there's also a few drawbacks to molecular formulas. So CH4 is another molecular formula, and that's actually the molecular formula for something called methane. And methane is a gas that we use in our homes. We use it usually, it's the main component in natural gas. So it's what we use usually to heat our homes and to use a stove if you have a gas stove. So it's very important to the way we live. But the molecular formula for really any compound, it only tells us what is in it, what is in a compound. It doesn't tell us the arrangement of the atoms. So the structural formula down here at the bottom, that tells us actually how the atoms are arranged. It tells us that carbon is in the middle and that each hydrogen is bonded directly to that carbon. So molecular formulas are helpful and they tell us a little bit about that compound, but we try to use other formulas and other models to help us understand compounds more fully. So last chapter we talked about ionic bonds, And now we're going to be talking about covalent bonds. So in covalent bonds, that's when we talk about molecules. So hydrogen gas, H2, is something that we call a molecule. And it is a flammable gas, and there's a single bond between each hydrogen in that molecule. Now in ionic compounds, for instance, sodium chloride, that's something called a formal unit. And what we're getting ready to do in a second is look at the structure of covalent compounds compared to ionic compounds. So the structure in covalent compounds, we have a hydrogen bonded to a hydrogen. And that is actually what we would call a molecule. Now, remember in ionic compounds, we would write a formula unit, sodium chloride, as NaCl. But remember, the structure of ionic compounds is actually like a crystal. So it's all these cations and anions being attracted to each other. So in covalent compounds, H2 actually tells us there are two atoms of hydrogen in this molecule, and there is one molecule and it floats around by itself. Now in ionic compounds, there's not just one sodium and one chlorine ion right next to each other. Remember, in ionic compounds, they are these crystals that are actually a bunch of these ions being attracted together. So what this difference in structure actually means is that there's no such thing as a molecule of sodium chloride. They're in that crystal lattice, and they're kind of locked in that crystal lattice. But there's actually a lot more differences between covalent and ionic compounds. Remember, in ionic compounds, we said that those bonds occurred between metals and nonmetals. In covalent compounds, these bonds actually occur between nonmetals. So two of the examples that were used today was CO2. Carbon and oxygen are two nonmetals. H2O, water, hydrogen and oxygen, that was another example. Those are two nonmetals. So covalent bonding happens between two or more nonmetals. Also, there's a difference in the phase. So remember, we said that ionic compounds were, for the most part, solids at room temperature. But covalent compounds can be solids, liquids, or gases at room temperature. So that's something that's very unique about covalent compounds. So that ends the lecture today over molecular compounds and covalent bonding. If you have any questions, I'd encourage you to write them down, and so that you can ask me the next time you see me. Thank you for listening. I'll see you in class.